Welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn. This is the third Lunch and Learn that we are holding in 2022, and we plan to continue holding them roughly monthly starting back in August after the summer. You can find out more about our Lunch and Learns through our newsletter. So if you're not already signed up to receive it, please let me know in the chat and I'd be happy to connect you and get you signed up. In a moment, I'll pass the mic, so to speak, over to our presenters, Sarah and Julia. But first, I just wanted to remind everyone about the intended format of these Lunch and Learns. So the idea is really to have these be a conversation among all of us, rather than just a Q&A. So you can sort of think about it as like a book club. Sarah and Julia will give us an overview of their topic, and then we'll kind of open it up for discussion between each other. And the hope is that this way we'll facilitate learning and help each other take action on this topic and every topic that we discuss in the future. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the Read by Fourth YouTube channel after the event. I'll also be sending out a post-event survey where we will ask for feedback on the format of this session, as well as solicit any ideas you might have about future Lunch and Learns that you might like to have us explore further. Always happy to entertain topic suggestions. And if you yourself have something that you might like to share with the Read by Fourth Partner Network, we would love to hear it and invite anyone to, to let us know. With that, I would like to briefly introduce Sarah and Julia. They will say more themselves by way of introduction, but Sarah Lytle is the Executive Director of Playful Learning Landscapes Action Network, and Julia Miller is the Program Manager at PLLAN. And with that, I would like to go ahead and have Sarah and Julia introduce themselves.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alex. And good to see you all today and good to be here with you all. As Alex said, we are both from Playful Learning Landscapes Action Network, or PLLAN, and we are the nonprofit implementation hub of all things playful learning. So we work a lot with our colleagues in academia and the research domain who are doing research on playful learning. And then we work very closely with our partners at the Brookings Institution who are focused on the policy and scaling of playful learning. So we think of our sort of whole group as a little bit of a tripod here with those three components: the research, implementation, and then policy and scaling. And together we really are trying to build this momentum and this movement of playful learning. So we're excited to talk a little bit more with you today about some of our design principles, in fact. So excited to give you some information. And so, as Alex said, the format, what we're trying to do is we've planned a sort of short, foundational piece at the beginning here, with the idea that that's going to give us fodder for discussions. We want to sort of, fuel the discussion that we hope we'll have in the second half of this session today. So since it's a relatively small group, I don't know that we have time for intros for everybody, but I do wonder if people could, maybe introduce in the chat and say what field you're in, because I think we have a variety of fields represented, and I think that will help us sort of tailor our comments to both particular fields and maybe just for our discussion later as we think about how different fields can work together. I think at the core of this playful learning work tends to be very interdisciplinary, and you can really think about it informing work for so many folks. And I, just by way of example, a team that we're working with in Omaha, Nebraska right now is really working with the Historical Society of Omaha, Nebraska, which is not necessarily somebody that you would think of as, the natural partner of playful learning landscapes. But, to the extent that we're marrying placemaking with, activities for families, they found a natural connection in the sense that the Historical Society is really interested in preserving spaces. And so they found a really cool partnership. So I think, given the interdisciplinary nature of this work, would love to get a sense of where folks are coming from. And while you all are doing that, I will turn it over to Julia Miller to lead us through the first half, and then I'll be back. So Julia, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Miller, and I'm so happy to meet you all. And as Alex mentioned, I am the newest member of PLAN as the program manager. My background is in play-based and social emotional learning, and I was a K-2 educator and a play-based learning specialist in a charter school in North Philly for the past 7 years. So because of my experiences in education, I'm just so excited to bring those into my position now and into the projects that we've been working on. So thanks again for having me. And before we start the slideshow, I just wanted to be thoughtful. And in regards to yesterday's event, I would just like to name that I'm just feeling so beside myself and overwhelmed today by how much work we have to do to shape this world into a better one for our children and our families. So I just wanted to say that in sadness and in solidarity with all the grieving families in Texas and across our country, we offer our deepest condolences and our commitment to continue to try to build a more empathetic and safer society for our kids. So with that, please take care of yourself and your loved ones today as we support one another through this sadness and absolutely senseless act. But no problem, thanks, Abby. So just politely shifting a bit towards our goals today. We are so happy to be here to present to you a framework that you can apply to the amazing work that you're already doing with our children and families. So we're going to take a deeper dive into the 6 C's and the 21st century skills that lead our kids to success. So let's jump right in.
And very quickly, are you seeing presenter slides or the real slides?
Good question. I'm seeing the real slides, so I think we're fine.
Okay, good. Always a good question. Go ahead.
Okay, so next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So we know that education is the most powerful engine for social mobility. So as you can see from this graph, about 80% of children's time is spent outside of formal learning environments. However, many families do not have access to high quality learning opportunities, especially in our city. So as much as we want to provide kids with all of these high quality formal learning environments, we also need to recognize that there's a lot of time in their daily lives that they are not in those kinds of environments. So we as Playful Learning Landscapes are constantly thinking about capitalizing those places and spaces where families exist during that 8% of their time. Next slide, Sarah. So a way for us to achieve this is by creating high quality learning opportunities for kids and families in spaces in their community that they will already have access to in the long term. And we believe that children and adults learn and develop skills from all kinds of play. And we know that kids learn best when the learning goals are intentionally integrated into joyful play. So we challenge ourselves to reimagine our cities and public spaces as playful learning opportunities for all learners, especially in Philadelphia. And so what we do is we think about bus stops, we think about grocery stores, we think about corner lots, laundromats, libraries, and places where families go to on a daily basis. And we want to implement playful learning opportunities for caregiver and children interaction. And so we think that this framework can be adopted successfully in a myriad of ways, but we like to think of it as a 3-step formula. So the formula that we use when designing a playful learning activity, a space, or a lesson is 1, how kids learn, 2, what kids learn, and 3, community values. So as much as we know about qualities of how kids learn, these are actually the same qualities that help humans learn best. And we call these the DAISY elements. So through decades of research, we have defined 5 qualities that really showcase how children learn. And we know that children learn best when their learning is actively engaging, meaningful, socially interactive, iterative, so that kids can have a different experience every time that they play, and joyful. So in order to make an activity or a space playful learning, we do want to embed all 5 qualities into any activity or space. So our next step in our formula is our learning goals. These goals are based on decades of research, so we can define these goals as what we call the 6 C's. And so when you look at the kinds of skills that we know are really going to prepare our children for the 21st century, the following are these skills: collaboration, communication, content, critical thinking, creative innovation, and confidence. And when we are thinking about building an activity or a space, we're not actually thinking about building in all 6, but we do try to build in at least 1 or 2. So now that I've been talking a lot about how children learn and the particular learning goals that we want to design activities and spaces around, the final piece of our puzzle is prioritizing community and their values. So our entire process is centered around a community engagement process that ensures that every single activity and every installation are based on community values, community culture, and community hopes and wishes and dreams for their children. And this is something we take very seriously as we start to think about creating playful learning activities and spaces that are meaningful and relative in a particular community. And because we know that no activity or idea will ever be repeated, this is because it's coming from the ideas and interests and cultures of a specific community. So when we put all these pieces together for our 3-part formula, we can finally create a playful learning environment. Okay, so using this formula, when we think about making and creating playful learning spaces, we oftentimes are not thinking about transforming the entire space as a whole, but instead we're thinking about making tweaks to the existing environment and transforming it into a playful learning activity. So here are 3 examples of how to tweak the environment and transform the space from activities to playful learning. So if you have a climbing pool, for example, on the playground, what could you do to make this playful learning oriented? So we believe that we could add hatch marks to the pole so that children can see how high they're climbing. And this could also be helpful when teaching or learning about measurements and distance, and maybe even making comparisons, what have you. And I know this particular example is very much tailored towards STEM and math skills, but you can also think of other ways to add diversity as well. A playground, for example, near a bus stop can also very easily become a bus stop with puzzles and games and different prompts to help children and family practice their spatial learning skills and build impulse control and offer kinesthetic learning as well. And then lastly, a library stocked with toys can transform into a library with giant blocks and alphabet climbing walls and geometric shapes to help children increase their math and literacy skills. Thanks, Sarah. So now it's your turn. And what I want us to do is, in this exercise, first we have a map activity, we have a corner store, and we have a mural. So I would like us to take a minute and look at these examples and see if we can transform this particular example from a free play environment to a playful learning space or activity. So if you want to think about this for about a minute, you can share some of your ideas that you have in the chat, or feel free to vocalize them out loud, but I would love to hear some ideas from you. So does anybody have any ideas for a map or a corner store or a mural activity that you can transform into a playful learning? I think somebody in our chat wants to see the 6 C's again, Sarah. It can be any idea that you have. Map, corner store, or mural. And remember, when we think about planning a playful learning activity, we want it to be fun and engaging, so it can be anything. Oh, great idea. Thanks, Abby. Prompts. I see signage. Excellent job. Yeah, signage and prompts are certainly a great way to engage parent and child interaction as well. Fun questions. These are great. Sheila said for a corner store, it would be fun to have a kid-sized checkout, like a kitchen set. I love that idea. That's a really good one. Another one I was thinking of, like, pin the tail on the donkey for a map. So wherever it lands, you can learn about that particular country and then do an activity with it. So the ideas are endless. But for example, especially in this kind of space and transformation from an activity to a playful learning activity, consider the corner store example. So this is something that we've done in the past where we took a corner store and we added a little light signage And in this case, we were asking a child to find out how much the produce weighed. But now, instead of children simply exploring the fruit, we've added an explicit learning goal, which will help children explore measurement. And this is likely to prompt all kinds of rich dialogue between children and caregivers, and just a way for kids to think outside of the box when they're in one of their daily activities. So, as we saw before, this is a place-based solution to providing daily opportunities for playful learning for all children and families. And thanks so much for engaging with me. But I'm going to send it over to Sarah to do a deeper dive into the 6 C's. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Julia. And Jill's suggestion about a neighborhood map too, that is really meaningful for kids. I love that because that incorporates some of those DAISY elements too. So I think that's a great suggestion to really think about, what is a map of your neighborhood with locations and landmarks that you might recognize. So that's wonderful. So now that we've talked about the formula a little bit about how we create playful learning landscapes, we want to dig a little bit deeper into the 6 C's because you really can get pretty deep here. So as Julia described, these are the 6 skills that we have really pulled from research as the skills that are really going to prepare children for success in a world where we don't necessarily know what job children are going to have 20 years from now. So how can we give them the skills that not only help them learn the skills that they will eventually need to know, the specific skills, but give them the skills that are going to set them up for success as humans in this world, and to be good friends to other people and have those social skills, but then also to have that content knowledge and ability to learn new skills along the way. So as much as we think of these 6 C's, you really can dive deeper into them. And so I think for any of you who are, sort of lightly familiar with playful learning, this is really where we tend to stop. But I think, we wanted to take this opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the 6 C's. And actually, if you look at the book that Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Roberta Gollenkoff wrote in 2016, they actually detail 4 different levels of each of these C's. And so we're taking this as an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into the 6 C's and really think about what they mean and how we can apply them to our work. And so what you see here is in this table is our 4 levels of each of the 6 C's. And for each one, level 1 is sort of the most rudimentary display of that particular skill. And you get a little bit more complex over as you go up this table, with level 4 being the sort of most, robust way that you could tell and discern this particular skill. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into one of these in a moment, but just to give you an orientation to this table. Now, when we think about the 6 C's and how these build over time, some of it is certainly, developmental, in the sense that, we would never expect a 6-month-old, for example, to get to level 4 of collaboration. That is just not developmentally where they are. But we also know that environments and experiences can scaffold and provide opportunities for children to reach different levels of these 6 C's. And so in that way, you can also imagine that, these you could apply these and start to apply these less as learning goals, but as descriptors of environments that we're in as adults. I think if anybody's ever been in a meeting with a room full of adults where tempers were high, emotions were high, and you think about where your communication was during that meeting, you probably weren't at a level 4, telling a joint story with the other people in that room. You were probably, somewhere in like a level 1, that raw emotion, or level 2. And so there are certain environments that can invite deeper levels of engagement in these 6 C's and invite, children and adults to interact in that particular way. And we think of these 6 C's as in sort of tornado fashion, building over time, in the sense that, collaboration begets more communication, which allows you to learn content knowledge, which allows you to think critically, which allows you to demonstrate creative innovation, which allows you to exhibit confidence. But it all kind of then cycles back together, because the more confidence that you have, the more you can collaborate. And so we sort of see this as this tornado-esque whirl of 6 C's building over time. And so when we think about how we might intentionally incorporate these 6 C's into the events, activities, environments that we create for kids, you can start to think about how you might design very specifically to not only address each of these 6 C's, but then also this concept of leveling up. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So to dive deeply into one of these 6 C's, for example, we can zoom in on collaboration. It's the very first of the 6 C's, and I think it's a good one to talk about in more detail. So as you see here, the first level of collaboration is on your own. There's really not much collaboration at all happening here. This is sort of, what will eventually be the building blocks of deeper collaboration. Next, you see side by side, and you might think about parallel play here. So you can glance at what the other person is doing. You might be aware of what's going on in your environment, but there's still not much turn taking or back and forth interaction, which then is level 3. So that level 3, that back and forth interaction, that kind of turn taking pattern we've all seen many times. And here you're working really in concert with another person, conscious of what they're doing and how it might affect you. And then finally, we have building it together as that level 4 collaboration. This is collaboration in its truest sense. You have a shared goal with another person and you're working together to achieve it because neither of you could achieve it on your own. So I hope you're beginning to imagine, examples of each of these levels. And I'm sure that you've all seen some of these. And so what I want us to consider today is how we can start to intentionally design environments to incorporate the 6 C's or a subset of them as learning goals, and then how you can level up. So if you have created an environment where you're at this sort of side-by-side interaction, that's kind of what you're seeing with the kids in the activities or the spaces that you've designed, what can you do? What tweaks can you make from that environment to take it from the side-by-side interaction to more of a back and forth interaction? If you have back and forth, how do you take it to that building together moment? So that's the sort of leveling up challenge that I would pose for all of us today to consider. And so you can think about that leveling up challenge with any of these. And you could think, for example, about, perhaps a book sharing moment where you're, or maybe, maybe a read aloud kind of moment. What kind of collaboration is that inviting? Where would you put yourself? If you were to use this almost as a rubric of self-assessment, where would you be on collaboration in a read aloud moment? Where would you be on communication? Where would you be on content? So literacy and some of those, literacy goals are content knowledge, right? Maybe there's some critical thinking involved. Maybe there's creative innovation. And remember, you don't have to hit all 6 C's with every activity, but figure out which of those 6 C's you have intentionally incorporated as learning goals, and then use this as a bit of a rubric to say, okay, where are we in that moment? And then the next task is getting to that next level. So to build on the example that Julia used earlier, so if we were to revisit these 3 activities and say a map activity, a corner store activity, a mural activity, imagine what your response was for that very first prompt. Think about it in relation to the table of the 6 C's. And now I want you to think about how you might level up. So if you want to play along with the example that we used the first time, we can do that, or you can use your own examples. So our example was a corner store, we're going to make it playful learning by incorporating a child-directed sign asking how much an item weighs. What's the level up moment there? How might we increase the sort of depth of interaction that we're asking of children and families? And so again, feel free, please, to share these in the chat or come off mute and let us know what you think.
And yeah, I would love to encourage anyone who would like to unmute themselves and share with us, share with the group. And Sarah, just to play back your question. So we are also hoping that folks will think about their own programs, right? And think about their own learning goals and kind of start to self-assess.
Yes, and we're going to get to more of the self-assessment in a minute, right? So yeah. Here, I think focus on sort of that leveling up concept. So if you take any of these activities, think about how you've converted it to playful learning, and then think about how you might level up, make whatever that learning goal is that you included, think about how you can go to that next level. Okay, so Rachel says, tell a friend the weight that you measured. So you're working on some amount of communication. And now that we've seen this, maybe it's helpful to go back to that table just so you can have a reference point of where we are. So Jill says confidence, the answer is correct. And I would like to hear more about that, Jill, but I think that that's an interesting one because it might actually get to what we're going to suggest as a leveling up activity for this, but would love to hear more about what you're thinking there.
What I'm thinking is that when the answer is correct and the child is given kudos for having doing it correctly, having the right answer, and understanding how important that is to the overall activity of shopping, and perhaps being mindful of money, things like that. So as the child gains confidence, he or she may feel emboldened to try other aspects of shopping.
Awesome. That's fantastic. So to put it in terms of this table, it's possible that without that critical feedback about, what the correct answer is, kids might be at that level 1 confidence. They're just going to barrel on. They're not getting any feedback. They're just going to, push forward regardless. But that feedback then might give them that level 2 bit of confidence, that sort of understanding of where I stand. So yes, it was correct. And that gives you that, as you say, the sort of motivation to barrel on. I like that. That's really good.
I want to add something to that. I'd like to train adults when they're complimenting a child who has completed a task, not to simply say, good job. That's not enough. The child won't know why it was a good job and how can I translate that, that good thing that I did to someplace else. So I would hope that adults would learn that good job because I needed the information and you did a good job of getting the information when I asked for it. Good job because you were very clear about the measurements, and when you weren't sure, you asked questions. So good job. Now we can go to see what the weight for the next item is, and that way you'll have done this task once and we can do it again. So
yes,
being very, very specific.
Yes, totally agree with you. I think specificity is important. I think you're also kind of getting at a little bit of that growth mindset. Everything that we know about, helping kids cultivate that growth mindset with, you're not just praising the end product, you're praising the process. So why was it what you did that was really good and effective here? So that's awesome. Thank you. Danielle says, for a mural and creative imagination, imagine where you could be in the mural, then leveling up, getting the voice and vision, talking about it with friends, or creating a story about it. Yes, absolutely. So I think that there's, I think with communication, so if you want to, focus on communication there, I think just looking at the mural would be kind of like a show and tell sort of a moment. And then you're suggesting leveling up to, going more to dialogue or telling a joint story. Yes, absolutely. Love it. So in the interest of time, let's move on and just, so one of the things that we thought of as a way to level up our child-directed sign asking how much an item weighs would be asking a child to predict how much a thing is going to weigh and then weigh it. Because if you look at our, and that's really thinking about critical thinking here as the learning goal, or as one of the learning goals of this activity, because you're going from that idea that you're going to simply weigh it and figure out what that number is, but then that prediction adds that additional layer of critically thinking about what is reasonable for a banana to weigh or for an apple to weigh. And so it's that different level of critical thinking. So in our minds, that's a level up kind of moment. So I can tell we're going to have a lot of really rich discussion, but I just want to set us up for this discussion by going back to this idea of using the 6 C's as a rubric. So this idea that you can do a little bit of self-assessment, think about the work that you do with children, with adults even, think about which of those 6 C's are the learning goals that you're trying to incorporate in your activity or environment for children and adults. And then you can start to think about, okay, what kind of activity do I typically see? What level of activity do I typically want to see? And what do you see and what do you want to see? And how can you start to think about making tweaks to that environment to create that level up moment? Now, understanding that it's not always going to be consistent, right? If somebody has a really terrible night of sleep, if a toddler misses a nap, there might be no environment in the world that is going to promote really high quality communication skills, right? You just might not be there, and that's okay. But I think what we're thinking about is, trying to take that, create the environment that's going to give kids the best opportunity to have that level up moment, and really incorporate those rich 6 C's. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like to move us into discussion and think about these discussion questions, among others. Which of the C's do you focus on in your work? Which level of those C's do you typically achieve? And not as any sort of a, you're doing it right or wrong. I think that it's a reflection on our environment and the kind of work that we're doing. And then how can you level up in your practice? Again, thinking about, maybe there are external factors that impact your ability to level up in a particular way. And then you can start to even think about these 6 C's as a bit of a measurement tool in a sense. So how might you measure your practice with the 6 C's rubric, with that sort of leveling mindset and using the 6 C's as those learning goals? So I'll offer those questions as starting points for our discussion, but would love to hear what kinds of additional questions and thoughts this has sparked for you all. I'd like to take down the slides just so we can see each other. I would like to see more of you than I can currently see, but happy to put them up and happy to drop these questions in the chat box too, to help facilitate this discussion. Thank you, Julia.
Sure.
Yeah, Rachel.
Hi, I'm a children's librarian, and I guess one of the big C's that we work on is communication, because that's a very important for early literacy. Talking is one of the foundational early literacy practices. And one thing that I find is that there's a broad range of inclinations parents have in the library in terms of communication. Some parents are like talking with their kid from the moment they walk through the doors, and some use a lot of directional language or like business language with their children. And all parents appreciate when I have toys out in the library, but just different parents approach those toys differently. And they will, I definitely have had this experience of like someone bringing their grandchild into the library, and they ask like, oh, are there toys? And then I show them the toys and, let them play with them. And the grandparent wants to keep talking to me. And instead of like, playing with the toys with their kid, and they'll ask like, is it okay that they're playing this way with the toys? And I'm like, is that okay with you? It's about your goals with your child, all that stuff. So I don't know how, and so I was thinking about having like signage with the toys of like those types of prompts, like with the magnet tiles, having things like how many shapes can you name, or can you put 2 shapes together to make a new shape? But I don't know how much that's going to be just more food for the parents who are already like on the communication train, versus like giving new ideas to parents who maybe are more business oriented with their child. Again, they like having the child playing, but they don't think of communication necessarily as part of that child's play. And like part of my job at the library is to introduce that idea and to encourage that. At least that's one of my jobs and how I interpret it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a great question. And, I think that at least from my perspective, and I would love to hear other folks' perspectives, I think from my perspective, at least, it's probably a pretty nuanced answer. Because I think, one of the things that we know is that you give parents too much text, too many suggestions, and they end up tuning it all out because it's just too much. And that's something that we found in some of our work. I will say we collect stories of like both the successes and failures of our work. And an epic failure were some grocery store signs that we designed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that we thought were absolutely beautiful. But at the end of the day, they were just too busy, and parents just ignored them completely. And so I think that there's, and we know that's true for kids too, right? I mean, if you give, there's lots of research about, kids in cluttered environments, and there's too much there, and it's overwhelming, and it's ends up being largely ineffective. And so I think that there is sort of that fine line of giving folks some fodder for discussion, some prompts, some prompts, but then thinking about, how much is too much. And there is a lot of research about how parents, benefit from some prompts. That has been, shown, over and over again. And I think, as adults, we are far less creative than kids are. And, we tend to be stuck in our ruts, both verbally, we say the same words over and over. I had to work myself out of an amazing phase one time because I said amazing for everything. And, it's something I got called on. It's, you have to switch that. And it takes effort to work yourself out of those ruts. But one way to do that is by giving prompts that elicit different kinds of speech, different kinds of words than we might use otherwise. So I think it can be really effective, but it is sort of that, that sort of fine line there. Yes, and I love Jill's suggestion. So engage the adult, ask if that adult has had a similar situation when playing, tell your kid if you had a favorite toy. Absolutely. And, and I think there's so much, here too about following the child's lead and, really, support it being the explorer along with your child, which I think is such a beautiful way to think about caregiver child interactions, that, take yourself out of the teacher role, take yourself out of the expert role, the parent role, and allow yourself to play and explore alongside your child. And that means, asking, I wonder if, or what would happen when, all of those kinds of, really true open-ended questions, and doing it without sort of the, I'm going to ask this, but I secretly know the answer kind of vibe, right?
Just to add too, I think I noticed that you said that there are grandparents that often come to you instead of playing with their kids, but to lean into the multi-generational side of things, I think a suggestion that I might have, especially to get grandparents to lean in to play with their child and increase that interaction and also that communication piece, is like maybe having a box of relatively older toys that grandparents might want to play with their grandkid that they remember or they can recall, and then they want to teach them, because that will also invite them to want to play with them instead.
I'll chime in there because I wasn't planning on kind of saying this in this direction, but it just kind of goes right along with what we saw. We have, and I think you guys know at CHOP these murals that we've put up, and we started with this very scaffolded version of these murals with lots of prompts and lots of very text heavy, we're going to show you how to play with this. And what we both found in watching people play with it, as well as getting direct qualitative feedback from them, is we don't need this. We don't need this back and forth. And so what I'd love to hear from you guys, I don't know that I've ever asked, was it sounds like this kind of jives in, is how does that go both with actively designed playful learning interventions, as well as toys and things like that happen. I think play happens more organically in playful learning ways. Is it best to just let that play happen more organically, to kind of let that flow, because that was the feedback we heard, is that parents know how to do the work, and if the tool is designed appropriately, it will happen appropriately, and things will level up on their own if the playful learning installation or device or toy or however is done in the right way, right? Things will level up. So that's how I'm trying to think about it in that level up way, is how can we make the thing level up without scaffolding with prompts or interaction, doing it that way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that I think that there are lots of nuances here, which is why I think that this is such rich fodder for discussion in terms of how do we actually apply this theory to the work. I think that I agree with you, certainly, that, when things are really thoughtfully designed, one of our design principles is that they are intuitive. We shouldn't have to teach you how to use the thing. We might give you prompts of a different way to use the thing, or something you might not think about, a way to kind of extend that learning. So I think that we are not anti-prompt. We are we are pro very short snippets of prompts, right? Very, very little language, but something that might inspire you to think a little bit differently about the thing. But one of our design principles certainly is that it has to be intuitive. There's no like long explanation, like you have to read the paragraph before you do the thing, because that just doesn't work. And so I agree with you. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, some of these prototyping type sessions are so important. And I think, here's an example, a real life example of a thing that we encountered recently that I think might help us think about this. We're working with a group in North Carolina that wants to do a mural in a laundromat space. And their initial idea was putting the alphabet on the wall. Not inherently a bad idea, but what we know about when you just have letters on a wall, caregivers and parents tend to go into like quiz mode as opposed to any sort of deeper discussion, right? Because it becomes like, where's the A, where's the G, or in the deeper level would be like, your name is Sarah, find the S. And that's fine, but it becomes this like quiz kind of interaction as opposed to more of the rich storytelling interaction that we know really supports literacy. And so if you think about this kind of leveling up concept, the alphabet on the wall, which we know is going to, maybe some parents are be super creative with it, and that's great. But by and large, we know from experience that's going to push lots of caregivers and parents to more of that kind of quiz mode, right answer, wrong answer, sort of communication style. So there's not really a ton of collaboration. There's not really, there's some collaboration, there's some communication, there's probably some dialogue going on. But if you really want to think about leveling up, what if you have, a really rich mural that tells a story across the wall, and maybe with a light prompt of, what happened, or who are the characters, or whatever it is, or maybe it's so intuitive that you don't even need prompts in that particular situation. But then you've given a way for caregivers and kids to talk about like storytelling and a storytelling arc. So who are the characters? What happens to them? What's the result? And from my perspective, that's a much more meaningful literacy kind of in communication activity than letters on the wall. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I guess if I was taking it back to my like example of like having magnet tiles out, a unhelpful prompt would be build something, because like that's intuitive, right? And that's just going to be ignored because like a person knows that they build with magnet tiles. But like my prompt of like maybe saying like maybe like a prompt saying like, what's the tallest thing you can build, or like, can you build taller than yourself, or something like that. Or maybe again that idea of what shapes do you notice, like again would be a little bit more if it's like if it's for my communication side of it, I would be like something like, what shapes do you notice? Because again, the building is intuitive, but maybe talking about the building isn't as intuitive.
For sure. And I think you can even be, more creative if you want to, like build your favorite animal. It's certainly going to be a very abstract representation of that animal, but that's very, it asks kids to be very creative with what they're doing. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think part of this too, and I will say again, another, by way of example, we recently did a co-design session, and we had a very astute 6-year-old look at this mural that we had designed that we thought was gorgeous. Everything we design, we think is gorgeous until we take it out into the community. And this very astute 6-year-old said, "Yes, but where are the flying cats?" Which was great. But if we sort of take a step back, like what was she telling us? She was telling us that we were way too literal in the mural. Like there was no fantasy element there. And 6-year-olds, like what do we know about them? They love unicorns. I mean, my 6-year-old niece is obsessed with rainbow unicorns. Everything has to be a rainbow unicorn, right? And we didn't have any of that. And so I think part of it is like, getting away from the adult mindset of like blocks build buildings. And, what if blocks could build something else? What if a block could build a unicorn? Like that would be very cool. And so I think part of it is actively getting out of our own way as adults in terms of how we're thinking about some of these pieces. So any other thoughts about or reflections about how the sort of 6Cs intersect with the work that you're doing with kids in the community, and then thinking about, opportunities or ways that you could start to level up?
Speak quickly. I think something that so I don't work directly with kids, but a lot of the work I do is research with families and what sort of, like, how can we make our assessments or our protests more playful? So something we found out that was really fun was how, I mean, families really love seeing their kids laugh and also laugh with their kids, and seeing this, I guess we call it communication, or even just seeing how creative kids can get with making their family. I mean, a lot of it is very, kids love kook humor, but all of this is interesting, just seeing how, well, I don't know. I think thinking about what is it that will make kids laugh, also engage them with the reading material for even just learning, where it's not just, well, this is an assessment, it's actually something that you can laugh with, also play with.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we have started to really try to be very intentional about incorporating playful learning into, the way that we engage communities and get information from communities before we build something. So, kind of moving away from traditional focus group models to actually, allowing the community to play and seeing what comes of that. And I think the same can be done for assessment. I think you're absolutely right. Assessment and evaluation. And I think the other thing in terms of, if we were to sort of layer more of a formal, historical education context over these 6Cs, I think that historically that content C is the one that schools and formal education programs have, of course, really been focused on, because that incorporates, your science, your math, your, all the history, all of those sort of core subjects. But I think the 6Cs framework, you can also think about it as a way to sort of broaden that set of skills and the things that we think are important to measure. So yes, of course, you're always going to need to know content, but I think it's probably just as important to me that a child is a really good collaborator and communicator, and somebody who can think critically, all of those skills that are going to, combine to really prepare kids for the future. And so I think that's another way that's another sort of framing on the 6Cs. It's not only, what environment are you creating and how do you level up, but really, at a very base level, even thinking about expanding what we think is important to evaluate. And, frankly, as a field, I think we're not real great at evaluating creativity at the moment, but, you certainly can evaluate a lot of those other Cs, and you can start to get to creativity, even if it's in, more anecdotal kinds of evidence. But that would be another way to think about this, is really, taking those 6Cs and really actively applying it as more of that, kind of measurement evaluation tool for your work. So we'd love to think about, external factors that impact your ability to level up, because I think that's, as much as we, might all, sort of endorse this idea and think it's great, I think there are very real considerations and things that, when rubber meets the road, you have to take into account. So, as you all are thinking about this concept, what are either some barriers or some, considerations that you have to take into account as you're starting to think about incorporating the 6Cs and then even leveling up the 6Cs? I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, certainly a person's disposition on a particular day, whether you've gotten a good night of sleep, eaten a good breakfast, all those things can impact. I'm also starting to think about, what happens on play streets, for example, and play captains when you're thinking about just doing work on a street, and in that environment that is certainly less under your control. That certainly would be, there are things there that might be considerations. Would love to hear other examples of that.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm wondering, like, for programs that are already kind of in place or already structured, like, what are some opportunities for leveling up, even when things feel, like the program is already defined and kind of in progress, in motion? What are some good ways to think about, like, leveling up even when there's not much room for, say, redesigning a program from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think, a lot of this, we've kind of come back to this idea of, what are the adult inputs in a particular situation. I think some of this is certainly, you can imagine tweaks to the environment, but in a situation where that's not the case, I think you could alternatively think about, how the adult is scaffolding a particular interaction. And so, I think, Rachel was talking about this too, but, thinking about, what are those prompts, and what is the sort of like level 1 prompt, what's a level 2 prompt, a level 3 prompt, right? If you think about, there's like a show and tell is one of those communications, but then it's telling a joint story. And you could imagine, a read aloud, for example. The show and tell is the sort of, where's the elephant? Do you see the elephant in the picture? But then telling a joint story is, what do you imagine that elephant ate for breakfast? And, thinking about, where you go from there, and, using that book as a sort of starting point to a broader interaction or a more extended interaction. And by the way, this is not to say, like, where is the elephant is the bad thing, right? I mean, that's a good thing. We need to have that too. But I think, if you're at a place where kids are clearly able to do that, developmentally, and you feel like they're ready for that next level, I think that's when you can really think intentionally about using your prompts and using how you structure that interaction to, kind of push kids a little bit further. I mean, for folks who are, zone of proximal development people, like this idea that you're kind of like pushing against boundaries, right? I mean, that's very much what we're, kind of thinking about when we're thinking about leveling up, is like, how do you either change the environment or change the interaction in a way that kind of pushes kids to that next level. I see V mentioned language barriers in some communities as being one of those potential considerations. And yes, absolutely. And I think, to the extent that we can give communities information in their first language, all the better, right? And if you go back to the sort of DAISY components the environments that really set up the best environment for that, create an environment for how kids learn. Meaningful, I think, is a really important one. So we're thinking about what do kids have reference points to? How can you, if you're talking about elephants, has a child in this community, do they know what an elephant is? We know that kids are going to learn best when they have, maybe they don't know everything about elephants, but they at least have a, concept of what it is. If it's something that's so alien to them, you kind of have to do a couple of steps to kind of get a little bit closer to that.
Any other thoughts from any of our participants about kind of what this all means to you, and how you think you might go about kind of implementing it or using it as you think about your own programs, your own work? And actually, on that note, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that this is a thing that might need to marinate for a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I would very much encourage you, Julie and I can put our emails in the chat box. And I think, we'd love to hear your continued thoughts, or, the thing that you think about, in the middle of the night tonight. And I hope you don't, but maybe you do. And want to talk about it later. Would love to continue this conversation, because I do think that it's a really interesting concept, and sort of, mapping that conceptual onto the sort of practical of the work that you all are doing in communities, I think is really an interesting topic. So thank you, Julia, for adding emails.
And Sarah and Julia, if you all have any resources that you would like me to share out with the group, I'm happy to do that as well. If there's something that you think people could get some use out of, just like having a visual, or we share like the 6 C's that we shared earlier in the slides, and that I think Julia shared in the chat earlier. Well, thank you both, Sarah and Julia, for today's presentation and sharing with us more about your work. Any other last remarks before we close?
Julia, anything? Oh yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Gil, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, every time you said 6 C's, I thought you were talking about the 60s.
Oh.
I need to enunciate clearly. Sorry.
Okay.
Apologies.
I'm having flashbacks. Okay.
Bell bottoms and the whole works. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. 6 C's.
No, I'm just so glad that we were able to have this discussion. Thank you so much for, offering all of your perspectives. And I just, I'm really happy to have been able to interact with all of you. But feel free to email me or Sarah, of course. Happy to answer any questions, and we can send out any resources that you might need. But just genuinely, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.
Thank you, Read by Fourth, for organizing. This has been great.
Of course. Everyone, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and thank you again for attending. And look for an email from me by this afternoon with just asking for your feedback and ideas for future Lunch and Learns. And thank you once again to Sarah and Julia. We really appreciate it.
Great. Bye, everybody.